All right, how we doing? Boom. Is that good? Focus there. All right. Okay. Welcome everybody. So, we are now going to be discussing the next element of World War II. We ended last class discussing the Hitler's first moves and the Nazis moving through Europe, coming through Scandinavia, and then the fall of France is where we end our last lecture. So now we're going to talk just a little bit of a review of what exactly happened in those years leading up to the war, and then the first moves of Hitler during the war. And today we'll talk about the Battle of Britain and the attack at Pearl Harbor, and talk about the Japanese. So first of all, we kind of see the timeline of the Nazis in mobilizing and preparing for combat. Hitler becomes the undisputed dictator of Germany in 1934, when President von Hindenburg dies, and the Enabling Act, which allows him to have unlimited powers, and essentially, eliminate all competition within Germany by getting rid of other political parties and censoring free speech and all these things. And then the following year is where he starts to mobilize Germany for war. In 1935, Hitler orders the creation of the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force. He also orders conscription, which is a draft, a military draft. In 1936, Hitler orders troops into the demilitarized Rhineland zone in between Germany and France, which of course is forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. In 1937, the Nazis bomb Guernica, which is the city in northern Spain, getting involved in the Spanish Civil War to support the fascist dictator Francisco Franco. In 1938, marches into Austria, the Anschluss, and conquers Austria, adds Austria to the German Third Reich. And then in 1939, he is continued to be appeased by Britain and France with that Munich Agreement, which gives him the Sudetenland. But then he pours the rest of his troops into Czechoslovakia. And then in September 1st of 1939, the Nazis invade the Poland with the Soviet Union. They both come in from either side, and now World War II has begun. Britain and France declare war on Germany, and we now have a war on our hands. But even after this has happened, we see the Nazis continue to invade countries, coming in and invading Denmark and Norway and Luxembourg and Netherlands and Belgium. And these are all to support, to get ready for the invasion of France and Britain, Hitler's biggest potential foes. Of course, the French, as we talked about last class, however, is sitting behind their defenses. They're sitting back and playing a defensive battle and waiting for the Nazis to attack them. And that, of course, proves to be a really, really poor strategy, because as we talked about last class, the Germans will come in up here as a feint and then blitzkrieg through the Ardennes forest right into France, getting right by that Maginot line. And by doing so, the French have no defenses and fall to Germany in only 6 weeks. This is a massive blow for the democracies of the world, a massive, massive blow for the Allies, because this great French fortress that fought so valiantly from 1914 to 1918 in World War I has now been defeated. And so now at this juncture, we see that the Nazis are going to split up France into two zones. One zone will be the North Zone, which is completely occupied by the Nazis, controlled by the Nazis, all the way until 1944. So for 4 years, this French portion, this northern portion of France, is completely controlled and occupied by Nazi soldiers. And then the southern portion of France is essentially run as a puppet government for the Nazis. It's a French person leading it, Marshal Pétain, but he has to do everything that Germany says, because if not, the Nazis will execute hostages in northern France. Obviously a terrible situation for France, obviously a terrible situation for Europe. When we look at the war in 1940, things looked very dire, very bleak for the democracies of the world. Of course, the United States isn't in the war yet. And the other thing that we talked about last class, and it's something that we have to know, is that the labor systems for each of these countries during the war. How does each country produce weapons of war and prepare themselves for war? The United States engages in total war. We mobilize all our civilians to work in factories, all these things. The Nazis did it differently. The Nazis would use slave labor. They would use conquered peoples and force them to work in the farm or on the factory to produce things to feed the German war machine. And that's exactly what happens in France. The Northern Zone has to pay a tax of 400 million francs a day to support the Nazi army of occupation. And then the Southern Zone often is forced to produce quotas for farming for the Nazis in this war. So nasty stuff, and looking very bleak. And now the only country that is left is Great Britain. Great Britain is the only country left in Europe at this stage. And Hitler knows that Britain still controls the seas. Britain has been the most powerful nation on the seas really since the 1500s, 1588 to be exact, when the Spanish Armada was defeated. And Britain has controlled the seas from that long. I mean, it's been amazing. And while the Germans have a superior army, they have a superior air force, the Luftwaffe, they know that in order to invade Britain, which of course is an island nation, they're going to need to destroy all of their naval ports. They're going to have to destroy all of their airports and then prepare for an actual sea invasion of Britain. And that's going to take some time. And so the Germans realize they're going to have to fight a battle first in the air. They're going to have to destroy the British in the air so that they cannot protect their fleet at sea. And so the Germans start to bomb Britain as early as August 12th, 1940. And we have really two sides on this. We have the British Royal Air Force, or the RAF, the Royal Air Force, versus the German Luftwaffe. The German strategy is to, again, attack those important ports and airfields to be able to stop the British from defending against a sea attack. Now, at this stage, you wonder perhaps, what is the United States doing at this stage? As we've talked about a little bit previously, the United States, guys, has a deep history of isolationism. It was George Washington that said in his farewell address in 1796, George Washington said that you need to stay out of European affairs, that it's good policy to remain isolationist, don't make lasting military alliances. And the United States largely followed that for long periods of its history. And again, when we entered World War I, there are many civilians and citizens that were frustrated that the United States entered World War I. And we said, why have we entered this war, which is largely a European affair? And many civilians, correctly, or at least partially correctly, said that it was because we followed business interests, because there was lots of money that we had tied in with the Allies, and that therefore that we are not going to get involved in World War II. This is a European affair, and therefore we shouldn't even be loaning money to the Allies. We shouldn't be loaning money to Britain or France. Instead, we should just be staying out of things, staying neutral, not trading with anybody, and that is that. Now, when that sentiment is unfortunately the kind of sentiment that's going to not allow France and Britain to protect themselves against a far more advanced militarily and far more industrialized Germany at this stage. Remember, Germany had a 5-year head start on producing weapons of war. And they desperately need, Britain and France desperately need American weapons of war to be able to defend themselves. Now, most American people say we need to stay out of this war, but our American president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, understands the importance of supporting Britain in this dire situation. France falls in June of 1940, and yet Britain is the only country left in Europe that is hanging on, right? This is the one last power in Europe that's hanging on. And FDR tries to rally the American people in the support of Britain. In fact, Even as early as 1937, which, Hitler hadn't even started to invade all of Europe yet. FDR saw the danger in Hitler. In fact, he gives this very famous quarantine speech in Chicago, where he says the danger of the 90% of the world is being threatened by the 10%, by lawlessness in Europe and in Japan. And it is of the interest of the United States and the democracies of the world to quarantine these 10% nations, to isolate them, to stop them. And when he gave this speech in 1937, he was showered with ridicule. He was actually accused of being a warmonger, of trying to go out and start unnecessary wars. And so FDR had to battle against a very, very strong isolationist sentiment in the United States. He had to battle against a Congress that was not interested at all in going in and entering this war, or even supporting Britain or France in this war, because it could draw the United States into the war. Now, it's interesting then what FDR does, because FDR knows that he can't directly aid Britain. He can't actually give them weapons of war, because by doing so, he is violating laws of Congress. In fact, Congress passed in 3 consecutive years what they called the Neutrality Acts. Neutrality Act of 1935, Neutrality Act of 1936, Neutrality Act of 1937. All of these laws that were specifically geared so that the United States could not sell weapons to Britain, sell weapons to France. And what that did was it made the U.S. kind of sit there and kind of twiddle their thumbs. But FDR gets creative after the fall of France, and really after the invasion of Poland, and tries to find out some ways in which he can circumnavigate Congress, get around Congress, so that he can help Britain fight against Hitler and the Nazis. And that's kind of where we're at when we get to the fall of France in June of 1940. Okay, so what was the U.S. doing? The U.S. is determined to stay neutral, blah, blah, blah. Congress passes a series of neutrality acts throughout the 1930s, yet FDR realized the rise of fascism was, in fact, a cause of war. Now, this one's fun right here. Number one, 1940. FDR is going to make an agreement with the British. Here's our situation. The Nazis are using their U-boats, their submarines that they used very effectively in World War I against the British. And they're starting to starve out the British once again. This was the same strategy again that they used in World War I. Nazi submarines being used around the island of Britain and stopping food and supplies from making it into Britain. And they're, eventually trying to keep Britain from doing anything at all and surrendering, right? Because they have no food to eat. Now, the way in which you combat submarines is you use destroyers, which are a naval ship that have sonar, which allows ships to detect as radar underwater where submarines are, and be able to drop what they call depth bombs from the actual ship and to combat these submarines. Now, the British were desperately in need of destroyers. They did not have enough destroyers to protect all of their merchant ships. Now, FDR in the United States is sitting there with lots of destroyers. They're not fighting a war. They have all of these available weapons, and yet FDR can't give these things to Britain because it's forbidden by Congress. Congress doesn't want to be loaning or giving weapons to anybody, right? So that's our problem. FDR is going to be so creative here in 1940. He's going to say, okay, I can't sell these to you, Winston Churchill. I can't sell these destroyers to you, Great Britain. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to trade them to you. How about I give you 50 destroyers that you desperately need, and you trade us 8 bases that you have in the Western Hemisphere. You're definitely not using them right now. How about we do a little trade? And that's exactly what he does. He doesn't even go through Congress. He says, no, I'm not selling these. I'm just trading here. And he gets perfectly around Congress and openly supports Britain. Congress can do nothing about this, and Britain gets these 50 destroyers that they desperately, desperately need, which is huge, right? Then, when we get to 1941, and this is before the attack at Pearl Harbor, which is December 7th, 1941, we see that Congress is finally being swayed by FDR. The fall of France is kind of the big, wake-up call for the United States. When France falls, this is a moment where the United States realizes we need to at least be prepared, and we need to desperately try our best to keep Britain in this fight. And so that's where we see the Lend-Lease Act. And this is, again, hilarious because it's still forbidden to sell weapons to Britain. It's still forbidden because Congress says, no, we don't want to have these economic ties. So the Lend-Lease Act is actually lending weapons to the Allies, in this case, Britain. Essentially saying, here, you need as many weapons of war as you can. You need tanks, you need planes, you need ships. We're going to lend them to you, and you're going to give them back to us after the war. Now, obviously, some of those things aren't going to make it back after the war, a lot of those things. And that's what's so funny about this law is that, in fact, this is thinly veiled support for Great Britain, almost direct support for Great Britain here, because we are producing now full-scale weapons of war and giving them to Britain to fight against the Nazis, to keep them alive, to keep them afloat while the Nazis continue to attack Britain each and every day. And then last but not least is the Atlantic Charter, which is a very Wilsonian type agreement. I say Wilsonian like Woodrow Wilson, our American president that's, obviously commanded us in World War I. The Atlantic Charter is most similar to Wilson's 14 points. Now, what it was two men, Winston Churchill and FDR, are going to come together on a ship just outside of Canada. And this is in August of 1941, so it's still before the U.S. has entered the war. But these two men, Churchill and FDR, are going to sit down and they're going to have a discussion about what they see the world should look like after World War II. If they come out of this war on top, how can we prevent all future wars? They outline plans and they talk about restoring self-governments around the world, and all countries, that are occupied are now having to be unoccupied by whichever countries have invaded, etc. So this idea of the Atlantic Charter, very similar to the 14 points, but it's interesting about this agreement because this Atlantic Charter, which was like a declaration that after the war, everyone would be able to rule themselves into self-determination. What it really looks like from places like Germany or Italy or Japan is that the U.S. is making open agreements with the nation at war. And so really all three of these things, the Destroy Us from Bases Deal, the Lend-Lease Act, and the Atlantic Charter, these are essentially, direct support of Britain, that even though the U.S. isn't at war, it's obvious to the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan that the U.S. is directly supporting Britain, and thus sort of an ally of Britain at this stage. And that's going to make the decision to attack Pearl Harbor a little bit easier for the Japanese, knowing that the U.S. is essentially really supporting, one of their adversaries. Now, the attack of Britain, or the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain was actually named by Sir Winston Churchill, who we've already talked about is one of my favorite historical figures of all time. So our situation is dire for Britain, even with the support of American machines of war, because Hitler's Luftwaffe, the Air Force, greatly outnumbers the amount of planes that the Royal Air Force, the British Air Force, has. But Hitler's own ego kind of gets in the way in this war. At first, the Luftwaffe was supposed to target military targets, factories, ports, airfields. But a British plane actually dropped bombs on the German capital, Berlin. And after a British plane attacked Berlin, Hitler is now going to order his Luftwaffe, his Air Force, instead to attack London. Nightly bombings on London each and every night. He's going to attack the civilians of Britain. And while this is terrible and why this is going to inflict casualties, the fact that they're attacking civilian targets allows the British to continue to run its military capacities, its airfields, its naval bases, and continue to produce weapons of war to fight against the Germans. So Hitler's own ego gets in the way of sound military strategy. And because of this, the British continue to fight. They continue to fight. And if you look at this picture here, and I know it's a little bit difficult to see, I'm going to try to turn off one of these lights. this is a bunch of British people in the underground, in the subway systems. What would happen is every single day, every night, the Germans would come in to bomb London, and the British would fire an air siren. We're under attack, and people would flood into the undergrounds, and they would stay underground while the bombings would go on. And Winston Churchill would take to the radio. He would come on the radio, and he would tell the British people that everything was going to be okay, that we're going to continue to fight, that we're going to continue to fight against this maniac Hitler. And that's exactly what they did. Thousands were killed, but the Londoners continued to stay determined. Speaking of Winston Churchill, let's talk about this guy. Okay, he is, a really, really important figure in world history. I've said it before, and I've said it again, that this guy is one of the most responsible people for the Allies winning the war. And I'll put it to you in this way. First of all, who is this guy? He's the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He was the first person to openly criticize Hitler and mistrust Hitler. Even in the early 1930s, even before Hitler's done anything, he says, this guy is not going to stop. You need to stop appeasing this guy, and you need to prepare ourselves for war. And that's what he was saying, but he wasn't Prime Minister then. Neville Chamberlain was Prime Minister. And because of this, Britain is really woefully unprepared for war. When he becomes the Prime Minister, he's immediately going to start preparing Britain for war, just kind of in the nick of time. And he's going to use the radio, as I said, to inspire the people of Britain to fight against the Nazis and keep up the fight, as the rest of Europe has already surrendered. A great quote here from Winston Churchill: "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Winston Churchill. And I've said this to you guys before, but I'll say it again. This leader, this guy, he's so persuasive. He was such, in many ways, a military genius, that he was able to convince our President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of the best presidents we've ever had, that even after the attack at Pearl Harbor, which occurred on December 7th, 1941, and, we have this deep isolationist sentiment in the United States. Oh, we can't get involved in wars. We can't get involved in this European war. And then we're attacked by Japan, right? And all of that isolationist sentiment goes away. And the American people are unified in saying, we need to go get Japan. We need to go attack Japan. We need to avenge Pearl Harbor. And so it would have been very easy for FDR to just go along with the American people and say, we need to send our forces west and we need to attack Japan. But he doesn't do that. And he doesn't do that because Winston Churchill convinces him that even though Japan is a threat in the Pacific, even though Japan just inflicted over 2,000 casualties unprovoked at Pearl Harbor, the bigger threat are the Nazis in Europe, and you need to send your armies east and go fight the Nazis first. And that's exactly what FDR does, and it proves to be the right decision in World War II. Had it not been for this guy, right, we may be all speaking German right now. We may have lost World War II in this moment. And so this guy proves to be huge in World War II. Now, this Battle of Britain, how did the British defend their island against the Luftwaffe? Two major things. The first one, and the biggest one by far, is radar. Radar is a British invention. The British invented it first, and this allows our planes to detect when the Luftwaffe, where the Luftwaffe are in the air, when they're coming. And it's especially important over Great Britain, which is always notorious for being very cloudy, very foggy, very rainy. It's difficult to see. And because the British had this radar, they had an extreme advantage over the Luftwaffe in the air. In fact, as the war went on, and this Battle of Britain is really going in the summer and the fall of 1940. France fell in June of 1940, and in August and September and October, these months are the Battle of Britain is taking place. Up above Britain, planes fighting over and over again. And, as these summer months are starting to end and we start to get closer to the winter, the weather only gets worse over Britain. It gets cloudier, it gets rainier, it gets foggier, and radar becomes even more of a weapon. On September 15th, the British Royal Air Force shot down 185 German planes, and the British only lost 26 planes. So 185 planes shot down in the Luftwaffe, only 26 planes shot down by the British. And what that showed you is the power of radar, how important this was in visibility, being able to know where the enemy is. So that was huge. Later on in the war, even after the Nazis have turned and gone a different direction, the British are going to crack Enigma, which was the German code. Every country would use a code that they would use to send orders to their troops, to their ships, to their planes, what have you. Because these messages could be intercepted by any country, they would have to be coded. They would have to have a certain code or machine that you would put these things through to be able to decode these messages. The German code was considered unbreakable. It's called Enigma. And the British employed a top secret force of code breakers to try and break this code. And they do in July of 1941. And when they did so, every time the British sent out a message, every time the Nazis sent out a message, a military command, the British would be able to intercept it and decode it and know exactly what they were doing. And this allowed them to know when attacks were coming. And so with this together, Hitler was officially going to call off the invasion of Britain on October 31st, Halloween of 1940. Now, Britain is safe for the time being. Safe is a little bit of an overstatement. They're not going to be invaded. They have prevented an invasion, but Hitler is still going to continue to use his U-boats outside of Britain. Britain is really in a dire situation, but Hitler realizes he can't invade Britain. So now he's going to turn somewhere else. But where else? Because there's no place really that the Nazis can go. They've already conquered all of mainland Europe, really with the exception of Spain, which is a fascist country that's essentially allied with the Germans, Italy, who is his ally, and Switzerland, which is a tiny little mountainous region. The only place left is really Eastern Europe, but over there you might get in trouble with the Soviet Union, who Hitler has allied with, or at least formed a non-aggression pact with, right before the invasion of Poland. So what is going to happen now? Well, first the answer is Hitler, after failing to invade Britain, is going to turn east. He is still looking for that Lebensraum, that living space. And so the first move is to invade into the new country of Yugoslavia and then down into Greece. And in fact, Italy is going to help in the invasion of Greece here. But why he's doing this, yes, it's for Lebensraum, but it's really to set up a massive surprise attack into the Soviet Union. Yes, he is turning on his alliance with Stalin, and he plans to invade the Soviet Union. And he does so initially incredibly effectively. In June of 1941, Germany is going to invade the Soviet Union. They surprise blitzkrieg into the country. They capture a tremendous amount of territory, and they captured 2 million Soviet troops. Oh my goodness. This is a death blow to the Soviet Union. It looks like the Soviet Union will not be able to recover from this. And in fact, they're already moving on one of the capitals of the Soviet Union, Leningrad, formerly St. Petersburg. This is a devastating surprise attack launched on the Soviet Union by the Nazis. And of course, the Soviet Union isn't ready for it because they have a non-aggression pact. They said they're not going to attack each other. And it looks like all is lost, except that the Russians, the Soviets, are going to use a strategy that has been used before 129 years previously. And that was used against Napoleon back in 1815. And that was the scorched earth policy. The Soviets are going to retreat into their own country. They're going to run away from the Nazis. And when they do so, they are going to intentionally burn all of their crops. They're going to kill all of their cattle. And they're going to move further and further in a retreat into their own country. And just like Napoleon made the mistake of following him into that country, not having anything to eat, not having anything warm enough to survive the cold Russian winter. The Nazis will follow them in. And the Nazi supply lines become miles and miles and hundreds of miles long, and it becomes very difficult to get any food. And this is going to be the start of the end for the Nazis. This is the big mistake that Hitler makes. This is the big mistake that Napoleon made, right? Now, interestingly, though, there's going to be some long sieges of civilian cities. There's two major ones in Russia, one of which is the Battle of Leningrad, which is up here, formerly St. Petersburg. Look, in war, when an army approaches a civilian city, it has always been the policy of leaders to surrender the city, that you don't want a civilian loss of life. Surrender the city. In this case, here's Leningrad. It should be surrendered to the Nazis. But Stalin, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviets, refuses to surrender his cities. And he's going to leave the civilians pretty much on their own. He does this at Leningrad. He does this at Stalingrad. The Nazis are going to put a 3-year siege over this city, over Leningrad, meaning they're going to surround it, they're going to blockade it, they're not going to let people in or out, they're going to try to starve the city out. And literally 1 million Soviet men, women, and children are going to die in Leningrad because Stalin refuses to surrender the city. He says, no, I'm not going to surrender. You're going to fight in the streets. You're going to have street-to-street combat against the Germans, but we are not going to surrender this city. And this is obviously a terrible strategy when it comes to civilian loss of life, but it's an effective strategy against the Germans, who have to sit there through the cold winters as they put siege to this city. And this strategy by Stalin, while it's going to amount in terrible losses of life for the Soviets, just like World War I, Russia is going to lose way more people than the other countries involved. But he can afford to lose that many people because he has this giant population in Russia. And eventually, the Germans are going to use all of their supplies and have tremendous loss of life sitting through these cold Russian winters. So, to summarize this, Germany invades the Soviet Union, turns on the non-aggression pact. The Soviets don't surrender. They retreat into their country. And then the Nazis put these long sieges on these Russian cities such as Leningrad with heavy, heavy losses of life. Okay, so now let's talk about Japan. Let's talk about Japanese and U.S. relations. And let's talk about the background to the attack at Pearl Harbor. So first of all, when do our kind of modern relations with Japan start? We know Japan was in isolation for hundreds of years, the Tokugawa shogunate. However, in 1853, the U.S. is going to bring Japan out of that isolation when we send over Matthew Perry in 1853. Japan is going to be opened up to the rest of the world. They're going to go through their Meiji Restoration, and they're going to become a radically modernized, powerful state, an industrialized military state. And then they're going to go off and start conquering lands for themselves. They're going to be an imperial power, but they're going to realize that they have some deficiencies in Japan, and two major ones. One, there's not enough land suitable for agriculture in Japan, and Japan has a very, very large population. So to be able to feed all of these people in Japan, they're going to need to conquer some new lands in which they can farm. This is one of the reasons why they attacked Manchuria in 1931. But also, Japan lacks very important raw materials such as oil, rubber, and iron. We know those are important for industrialization. We've talked about that in our last unit. Oil and rubber and iron. All of these are also important for building weapons of war. Planes, tanks, guns. All of these things need oil and rubber and iron. So these things that Japan lacks are very important for Japan to acquire if they are going to remain a strong military power. And Japan knows this. Japan leaders know if it's going to stay a world power, it needs to get land that is rich in iron, in oil, and in rubber. And so Japan is going to look to start to take over some land. It attacks China initially in 1895. in the First Sino-Japanese War, and it gains Taiwan. It attacks Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905, and annexes Korea. So it has already started to take over land, and these lands are available to produce food, but we are still missing oil, we're still missing iron, and we are still missing rubber. And so then Japan is going to launch a major invasion into China. In 1931, Japan invades Manchuria. We've already talked about that. And in 1937, the full invasion of China comes. This is the Second Sino-Japanese War, the second massive invasion. Japan invades East China. We remember that the Chinese were actually fighting a civil war at this stage. The communists had run from the Kuomintang party in a long march. The communists and the Kuomintang, the nationalists, are going to put aside their differences and come together in a resistance of Japan. They're going to put aside their civil war and say, we need to resist the Japanese invasion of China. We are at full-out war between China and Japan in 1937. And this is the really nasty part of the war for the Japanese. The Japanese are going to, in China, commit some terrible war crimes that their leaders will be held accountable for. And many of the Japanese leaders responsible for these war crimes will be put to death or executed after the war. But the style of warfare that the Japanese use in China becomes very, very telling. It becomes very, very telling that the Japanese are not going to surrender and that they are going to do some really vile tactics to their enemies. Especially in what we call the Rape of Nanjing. So we see that the Japanese are going to launch a full-scale invasion and win a long battle at Shanghai, a month-long battle, and this actually slowed down the Japanese quite a bit. They thought they were going to be able to move through the Chinese forces much quicker. China puts up a fierce resistance. But then when the Japanese make it to the capital at this stage, Nanjing, this is a largely civilian area. We see about 600,000 civilians living there. And the Japanese are going to kill ruthlessly 300,000 of these civilians. They are going to kill men, women, and children. And the historical estimates say that they rape tens of thousands of women, even younger women. Really, really gross stuff, guys. And then they're going to execute all of the prisoners of war. All of the Chinese prisoners of war that they have captured in this battle, they're going to execute. Some of them really in nasty ways, torturing them before that. And the reason why they do this is because in Japanese culture, it was looked at as something unthinkable to surrender, that you would never surrender to the enemy. And this was taught to the Japanese at such a young age. And really had been taught for centuries. I mean, if you look at the samurai and how they were taught to defend their masters, and even if their master was killed or defeated, that they would commit suicide with their own samurai sword rather than surrendering. And so what this treatment of the Chinese taught the Allies was that Japan was not going to surrender easily, and they were going to do some really, really vile tactics to win the war. And this is part of the reason why President Truman in 1945 justified using the nuclear weapons, because he thought the Japanese aren't going to surrender. And so these sort of weapons are justified. Now, whether that was justified or not is up for you to decide, but that is one of the things that Truman used. Okay, let's talk about the attack at Pearl Harbor. So our Prime Minister of Japan at this stage is a man by the name of Hideki Tojo. He has this idea of creating the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And this is supposed to be a defensive perimeter. And this defensive perimeter was going to... I'll put it this way. The Japanese have an idea. They say, look, the Pacific is rich. The Pacific Ocean and the islands within the Pacific Ocean are rich with iron, oil, and rubber. And we need to acquire these things if we're going to continue to produce weapons of war. However, these things have... these islands, these lands are being controlled by Britain, by France, by the United States, by the Dutch. And so we need to figure out a way in which we can get these lands and acquire these resources and then defend ourselves from losing these lands back to these countries. Tojo is going to propose coming in, seizing all these lands, and then forming a defensive perimeter around the Pacific so that none of these lands can be retaken by the United States, by France, by Britain, by the Dutch. So he is going to form this greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, seize all these lands in the Pacific, and not allow anybody to take them back. So that's his plan. And by doing so, he's going to drive the Western powers out of the Pacific and free Japan from its dependence on Western oil, rubber, and iron. Because here's the situation, guys. If Japan's at war with the United States, which they're not yet, the United States hasn't entered the war, Japan gets most of its oil from the United States. It gets most of its oil from the Netherlands. If Japan enters the war against the Netherlands, against the United States, what happens is they lose their major source of oil. If the war drags on, they're not going to be able to fight a war. They're not going to have enough oil to do so. Japan needs to be able to acquire lands that have oil, that have rubber, that have iron, so that they can continue to build things themselves, weapons themselves, to be able to fight. That's the idea with the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And if we look at this map is very telling. Get out of your way so you can see this. So here's Japan, right? And they've already invaded Manchuria in 1931. They invade China in 1937. And what we have here, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere would be a defensive sphere in the Pacific. Japan wants to control all of these lands here. All of these lands have everything that the Japanese want. For instance, down here in French Indochina, that's Vietnam, right? And the French have been controlling this for quite some time, and they have been producing rubber there. The Japanese know it. The Japanese can seize the rubber plantations in French Indochina. Malaya, down here. Malaya is a British colony. It's the #1 producer of rubber in the world. And how about the U.S. controlling the Philippines? Here, Philippines has iron that the Japanese can conquer, that they can take. And then, of course, the Dutch East Indies, just off the map, down here, the Dutch East Indies is rich in oil. So the Japanese, now, if they can come in and conquer all of this East Asia prosperity sphere over here, all of these lands, then they can hold those lands, build up their defenses, and now they have control of this huge empire that's rich in all these resources, and they don't have to trade for any of these resources from anyone else. Now, it sounds like a very, very difficult thing to do. How are you possibly going to come in and defeat the Dutch, the French, the United States, and the British? It seems impossible. But it's not impossible in 1941, and it's not impossible because 3 of these countries are completely unable to defend themselves. Now look at it. The Dutch, they control the East Indies, right down here. But the Dutch have already surrendered to the Nazis in Europe. The Dutch are not going to be able to defend the Dutch East Indies down there. They are fighting for their lives under Nazi occupation in Europe. So the East Indies are wide open for the taking. The French have also surrendered to the Nazis. They, in fact, have this, big colony over here, French Indochina, but really they can't control this colony right now. They're under Nazi occupation. The French have already surrendered. They're wide open for attack. Britain is hanging on by a thread in the Battle of Britain. Every single day they are fighting to defend their island from German Luftwaffe bombers. All 3 of these countries, the Dutch, the French, and the British, are not able to defend their colonies. The only country that would be able to stop the Japanese from forming this Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere over here is the United States. The United States is not in the war. They're a strong industrialized nation, and they already control lands in the Pacific. They control the Philippines, they control Midway, they control Guam, and of course they control Hawaii, which of course is where Pearl Harbor is. If the Japanese can launch a devastating attack on these places and weaken the American military so much that they can't defend themselves, that will give the Japanese time to form this Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. That is what we're talking about here in 1941. And the United States is going to force their hands. Now, the United States is very concerned about this Japanese aggression that's taking place, And the U.S. is going to impose a trade embargo on Japan. What that means is we are no longer trading anything with you, especially strategic materials such as oil, metal, and steel, which is metal, obviously. And so at this stage, Japan is forced to act. If they're going to wage war and continue to be a world power, they need these things, especially American oil. They only have 2 years worth of oil left. And so their oil will start dwindling immediately unless something is done about this. Japanese leaders know this. And so if Japan can come in and cripple the U.S. Navy, that the U.S. might seek peace. The U.S. might say, we can't fight you, we have to surrender. And so it just so happens that the U.S. Navy, in fact, all 8 of the American battleships are stationed at Ford Island in Pearl Harbor. The major battleships of the U.S. fleet are all stationed together at Pearl Harbor. If these battleships are sunk by the Japanese, the U.S. would not be able to retaliate, the Japanese estimated, in years. Perhaps for 10 years it would take them to build this new Navy back. And so, with this in mind, the Prime Minister of Japan, Hideki Tojo, authorizes attack at Pearl Harbor. And that is where we will leave for this lecture. Wow.